I don't consider myself a curious man. My job is simple, clean, keep my head down, and go home. That's how I've spent the last 22 years working at the station. I don't ask questions. I don't poke around in things that aren't my business. That night, I should have done the same. It started with a routine assignment. The sergeant wanted the basement storage room cleaned out. Something about fire hazards and too much clutter. I'd only been down there once before, years ago. The place was a graveyard for old case files, broken furniture, and forgotten evidence. When I unlocked the door, the scent hit me first. Stale air, dust, and something deeper, heavier, like old paper left to rot. The single overhead bulb flickered when I pulled the chain, casting long shadows over the rows of rusted filing cabinets and collapsed shelving units. I started by clearing the cobwebs, wiping down the metal cabinets, and sweeping the floor. That was when I saw it, a wooden box, shoved into the farthest corner of the room, almost hidden behind a stack of water-stained folders. Unlike everything else, it wasn't covered in dust. Someone must have moved it recently. I almost left it alone. Almost. But something about it drew me in. The rough wood, the faded black lettering stamped on the lid. Unopened, do not disturb. I hesitated. I knew better than to mess with old police storage. I'd heard stories, boxes of unsolved cases, evidence from long-forgotten crimes, things that never made it into the official reports. But there was something strange about this one. It had no case number, no date, no sign that it belonged here at all. I crouched down, running my fingers over the rough wood. It was old but sturdy. The nails holding it together were rusted, the corners splintered with age. I pulled the lid. It took effort, but after a few tugs, the nails gave way with a dry creak. Inside, there were documents, a thick stack of yellowed papers, photographs, and typewritten reports. The smell of aged paper and something else, something metallic like dried blood, rose from the box. I picked up the first photograph. It was black and white, grainy, but the image was clear enough. A man sat in a metal chair, his body slumped forward. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and sunken. His hands were tied behind his back, his head tilted downward. At first, I thought he was asleep. Then I saw the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. I dropped the photo, my breath catching in my throat. It fluttered to the ground, landing face up, those hollow sockets staring at me. I swallowed hard and reached for another document. The top of the page read, Dr. Viktor Mikhailov, Subject 34 Report. I didn't recognize the name, but something about it sent a chill through me. I skimmed the first few lines, my fingers tightening on the fragile paper. Subject 34 has survived the procedure with minimal resistance. Expected sensory degradation confirmed. Subject displays heightened response to auditory stimuli. Further testing required. There are medical diagrams beneath the text, sketches of human anatomy, specifically the nervous system. Notes in the margins describe something I barely understood, something about altering pain receptors, prolonging nerve response. I turned to the next page. Day 12. Subject remains responsive, but does not speak. Removal of eyes has not resulted in termination. Signs of continued cognitive function present. I stared at the words, my hands trembling slightly. Removal of eyes? Cognitive function present? I glanced back at the photograph on the floor. The man in the chair wasn't just a corpse. He had still been alive when the photo was taken. My pulse pounded in my ears. I looked deeper into the box, flipping through more documents. Names, dates, medical terminology I couldn't begin to understand. Every report detailed a different person, each subjected to some kind of horrific procedure. Most of them were prisoners, their names listed with numbers beside them. Inmate IDs, I realized. There were more photographs. Some showed people strapped to beds, their limbs contorted in unnatural angles. Others depicted faces sewn shut, mouths forced open with surgical clamps, bodies with exposed nerves. Then I found a map. It was old, the paper brittle, edges curling. It showed a farmhouse, isolated in the middle of nowhere. Next to the drawing was a single line of handwritten text. Primary testing site, do not approach. I suddenly felt lightheaded. This wasn't just a forgotten case. This was something else, something no one was supposed to find. I had to stop. I had to put everything back and leave. But my hands kept moving. At the bottom of the box, beneath the final stack of papers, was a small sealed envelope. There was no writing on it, just a deep red wax seal, unbroken. I hesitated. My body screamed at me to stop, to walk away and pretend I never saw this. But I was already too far in. I slid a finger beneath the flap and broke the seal. Inside was one last photograph. It wasn't black and white. It wasn't grainy or faded. It was in color, and it showed my police station, the basement storage room, this very room. And standing in the doorway, staring straight into the camera, was me. The photograph slipped from my fingers. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at it, the edges curling slightly on the cold cement floor. I wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake, some kind of sick joke. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The angle of the photo was impossible. It was taken from inside the room, from the farthest corner, capturing me crouched over the box with my back to the door. But when I had just opened the box for the first time, there was no camera, no one else in the basement. And yet, here I was, frozen in time. I felt the weight of the air pressing in on me. My skin prickled with cold sweat. My first instinct was to destroy everything, to shove the files back in a box, throw the photographs into the nearest trash bin, and pretend I never saw them. I could lock the basement and leave it buried. But I didn't, because beneath my fear, beneath the growing nausea twisting in my gut, I felt something worse than dread. I felt curiosity. I forced myself to breathe, steadying my hands as I picked up another document. The typewritten text was barely legible beneath smeared ink and old stains, but I made out enough. Project Hollow Man. Subject 47 report. That phrase again. Hodoman. I turned the page. It was a case file. The subject's name had been redacted, replaced by a number, 47. Below that, a list of details. Age, 31. Nationality, Soviet defectee. Initial condition, severe malnutrition, multiple fractures. Procedure outcome, subject remains conscious despite total loss of sensory input. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding against my temples. Total loss of sensory input? I flipped to the next page. This one was handwritten. A different tone, less clinical, more frantic. The subject should have died. Every record states that without sensory input, brain function should deteriorate. But the body refuses to shut down. He doesn't speak anymore, but we know he's still there. The way he moves when we enter the room, the way he tilts his head like he's listening. The note ended abruptly. The next page was stained, the ink running in thick, waterlogged streaks. But I could still make out a final line, scrawled at the bottom. Once the vocal cords are removed, the screaming stops. But the eyes, God, the eyes. A sharp noise broke the silence. A creak from a far end of the basement. My head snapped up, heart hammering. I wasn't alone. For a second, I didn't move. I strained my ears, listening beyond the thudding in my chest. Nothing. The air was still, heavy. The dim overhead bulb flickered again, casting shadows along the rows of old metal cabinets. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the weight of the room was getting to me. I turned back to the files. Another creak. Closer. This time, I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. My pulse pounded in my ears. There was someone in the basement with me. I scanned the room, but there was nowhere to hide. Just metal shelves, old furniture, and stacks of forgotten evidence. Then I saw it. The basement door. It was open. I knew I had locked it when I came in. A cold realization settled over me. Someone else had been down here. Someone had opened the door. And now, they were watching me. I backed away from the box, moving slowly toward the staircase. My footsteps sounded too loud, my breathing even louder. The basement felt darker now, the air colder. I reached for the light switch, flicking it twice. Nothing. The bulb flickered one last time, and then darkness. I froze. My pulse was deafening. Then I heard it. A whisper. So faint it might have been my own breath, but it wasn't. It came from the doorway. A single word, barely audible, not in English. I didn't wait to hear it again. I turned and bolted. I don't remember running up the stairs, don't remember bursting through the door and into the hallway. All I remember is the feeling like I was being chased, like something was right behind me, reaching out. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, my lungs burned. I doubled over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I had to tell someone. I had to report this. But as I turned toward the station's main hall, ready to find the nearest officer, something stopped me cold. The station was silent. No voices, no ringing phones, just empty desks. I checked the clock. 10:07 p.m. It should have been shift change. There should have been dozens of people here. But there was nothing. Like the entire station had been abandoned. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe they were in the back. Maybe I had lost track of time. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, past the front desk, the door to the interrogation rooms was slightly ajar. And from inside, something moved. A shadow. Watching. Waiting. I should have left right then and there. Should have walked out of the station, gotten into my car, and never come back. But I didn't, because I still had the final photograph clutched in my hand. The one of me in the basement. The one someone had taken before I ever opened the box. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I left now, I would never get answers. So I took a deep breath, and I stepped toward the interrogation room. The hallway stretched before me, silent and empty. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave the station, drive away, and never set foot here again. But I didn't. I stepped forward, one foot after the other, toward the open door at the far end of the hall. The interrogation rooms were rarely used, their dull gray walls built to suffocate sound. The air inside was thick, stale. The fluorescent light flickered above, casting sharp shadows. I stood at the threshold, trying to slow my breathing. The door was open just enough to see inside. A chair, a table, a figure in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out its face, only the outline of a slumped body, motionless. Then a whisper, soft, faint, not in English. The same whisper I'd heard in the basement. The breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the photograph, still clutched in my hand. I took a slow step inside. The floor creaked beneath me, and the whispering stopped. I held my breath. The figure twitched. Then it moved. A low, wet dragging sound as it shifted. The smell hit me next, metallic, thick, rotting. My stomach churned. I fought the urge to run. A second passed. Then another. The thing in the corner slowly turned its head. A face pale, sunken. The skin was taut, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Its lips were cracked, barely more than a thin line of dried blood. And its eyes? Hollow, black, empty sockets surrounded by bruised, raw flesh. No eyes, but somehow I knew it was looking right at me. I stumbled back, knocking against the doorframe. My breath hitched. The figure in the chair didn't move at first, just sat there, watching without eyes. Then its lips parted, and it spoke. A single, rasping word, in perfect, clear English. You shouldn't have opened the box. A chill raced down my spine. My fingers went numb, the photograph slipping from my grasp. I wanted to say something, to ask what the hell was happening, who he was, what he meant. But before I could, the figure stood. The motion was unnatural, jerky, disconnected, like a puppet on strings. It didn't rise so much as unfold. The whispering began again, this time from behind me. I spun around, nothing, just the empty hallway. When I turned back, the chair was empty. My breath caught. The thing wasn't in the room anymore. The light above me flickered violently. I took a step back, then another, until my heel hit something on the floor. The photograph. It had landed face up, but something was wrong. It wasn't the same image anymore. Instead of the basement, instead of me kneeling over the box, it showed this interrogation room. The same chair, the same table, and behind the chair, a dark figure standing just over my shoulder. I felt it before I turned. A presence. Something right behind me. I ran, out of the interrogation room, down the hall, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Everything was wrong. The station fell off, like the air had thickened, like the walls were closer together. When I reached the main hall, the desks were still empty. But now, there were documents scattered everywhere. Old, yellowed files. Stacks of papers, just like the ones from the box. As if someone had been going through them. As if someone else had been reading. My chest tightened. My mind screamed to me to get out. But then I saw the basement door. Still open. Something was down there. Something waiting. I don't know what made me go back. Maybe it was the need for answers. Maybe it was some twisted pull I couldn't fight. But I found myself descending the stairs again. Step by step, the air grew colder. The overhead light flickered once, then went out entirely. Darkness swallowed the basement. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. When the beam cut through the dark, I felt my stomach drop. The wooden box was still there. But now, it was open again, and the documents were gone. The whispering returned. Louder this time. Closer. I swept the flashlight across the basement, my breathing sharp, my hands slick with sweat. The shadows shifted. And then, at the farthest corner of the room, something stepped forward. Tall, thin, flesh stretched too tight over bone. Head tilted slightly like it was listening. No eyes, no mouth, just hollow, empty skin where its features should have been. A hollow man. My body locked in place. I tried to move, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. The thing lifted one hand, long fingers curled. And then, in a voice too familiar, a voice that sounded exactly like mine, it spoke. You shouldn't have opened the box. The flashlight flickered. The whispering grew deafening. And then, the light went out. The darkness swallowed me whole. I stood frozen, the weight of the air pressing in on my chest. The whispering didn't fade, it grew. It came from every corner of the basement, slithering across the concrete floor, slipping through the rusted filing cabinets. My hand was locked around my phone, but the screen was dead. The flashlight had cut out the second that thing spoke in my voice. I tried to move, to back away from where I'd last seen it standing. But my body wouldn't listen. I could feel it watching me, even without eyes. Something brushed against my shoulder. A breath of air, warm and wet. I bolted. My legs obeyed this time, shoving me forward. I ran blind, arms outstretched, my fingers scraping along rusted metal cabinets. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, my knee cracking against the concrete. The whispering stopped. Everything went silent. I forced myself to breathe through the pain, pressing my hands against the floor to push myself up. That was when I felt it. The ground beneath my palms was damp, sticky. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see, but I had to. I lifted my hand to the dim light filtering in from the open basement door. Blood, thick and dark, smeared across my skin. And then I saw it. Not a puddle, a trail. I scrambled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The blood led from the far side of the room, snaking toward the wooden box, and then past it, toward the metal door at the back of the basement. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended with the wall, rusted and thick, sealed shut with a heavy wheel lock. I should have run. I should have climbed the stairs and never looked back. But something inside me, the same thing that had kept me from walking away from the box in the first place, needed to know. I followed the blood. The wheel lock was stiff with age, but it turned. A dull clank echoed through the basement. The whispering started again. A chorus, faint and distant, like voices behind glass. The door creaked open, revealing a second room. Cold air spilled out, thick with the stench of rot. I stepped inside. The first thing I saw was the chair. It sat in the center of the room, surrounded by rusted medical equipment. The straps still hung loose from its arms and legs, stained dark. The walls were lined with old medical cabinets, their glass doors shattered. Jars of preserved organs sat on metal shelves, their contents long since decomposed into murky liquid. And on the far wall, lined up in perfect rows, photographs, hundreds of them. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I lifted one from the wall. It was the same as before, black and white, grainy. A man sitting in the chair, his head slumped forward, his eyes missing. I looked at the next one, another man, and the next, and the next. All the same, different people, the same empty sockets. A metallic creak sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned toward the back of the room. Another door. This one wasn't rusted shut. It was open. Beyond it, a narrow hallway stretched into darkness. The blood trail continued inside, and at the very end, a shape, motionless, slumped against the wall. I stepped forward, my breath shallow. The figure was wearing a lab coat. One sleeve had been torn away, revealing a skeletal arm. Flesh clung to the bone in patches, gray and dry. The face, or what was left of it, the lower jaw, was missing. A deep gouge ran from where the mouth should have been to the top of the skull. But despite the decay, despite the age, I knew who I was looking at. I had seen his name on every report. Dr. Viktor Mikhailov. I staggered back. His hands were curled against his chest, clutching something. A cassette tape. I hesitated only a second before reaching down and prying it from his stiff fingers. The plastic casing was cracked, but the label was still intact. Final experiment, 1974. There was a tape recorder sitting on a metal cart beside the body, caked in dust but still intact. I didn't want to listen. I had to. I slid the cassette in and pressed play. A burst of static. Then, a voice. Shaky, breathless. Mikhailov. They told me to stop. They told me it had gone too far. A pause. A clatter in the background. Subject 47. He does not die. I've taken everything from him. His sight. His voice. His name. A heavy breath. And yet he remains. A scraping sound. Metal against concrete. A chair moving. Then, he is awake. Silence. A faint creak. Mikhailov's breathing turned ragged. He is looking at me. A whisper in the background. Low. Inhuman. The whispering I had heard in the basement. Mikhailov gasped. No, it is not possible. You. A scream. The recorder cut out. The whispering around me grew louder. Not from the tape. From the hallway. I turned. The blood trail was moving, like something was crawling toward me. I saw it then. A figure pulling itself from the shadows. Gaunt. Hollow. No eyes. No mouth. But it spoke. A voice I recognized. You shouldn't have opened the box. The light went out. I ran. Out of the room. Past the chair. Past the broken cabinets. Back into the basement. The stairwell was ahead. I sprinted for it. Something moved in the darkness. The whispering became deafening. A presence right behind me. I reached the stairs. A hand brushed the back of my neck. Cold. Wrong. I burst into the hallway, slamming the basement door shut behind me. And then, silence. I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was in my car, until the station was nothing but a shape in my rearview mirror. I don't know how long I drove, but when I finally stopped, hands shaking against the steering wheel, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My hair. It had been dark when I left for work. Now, it was gray. I never went back. I never spoke about what I found. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of whispers in my room. And when I look into the darkness, I know something is watching, even without eyes.